Hello and good morning, everyone. We're about 1 minute past 10, so I will make a start. Obviously, you can skip back to the start if you've missed this and you've joined slightly afterwards. This event has been recorded as well, so you'll get this link shared afterwards. So hello and welcome to this Planet IT and Sophos joint webinar about ransomware in the real world. It's great to have you all with us for the next in our series of Planet webinars. We've been doing this for a good few years now, and it's become quite a regular event for myself, and it's something that's quite enjoyable, and it's nice to be able to share these thoughts and ideas with everyone. For those of you who are joining us today and you don't know who Planet IT are, it's the first time you've met us or spoke to us. So Planet IT, we are the kind of the one-stop shop for all things IT needs. So from outsourced IT support through to internet connectivity, through hardware, software procurement, and obviously we are IT security experts, which is why we're here today, and we're working in partnership with Sophos, who we're a platinum partner with, to deliver today's content to you. So really for us at Planet, today is about sharing expertise with you and hopefully helping you understand some of those real world threats that we're seeing at the moment. But if there's anything you need, any IT needs top to bottom, reach out to us and we should be able to help. And obviously we'll point you in the right direction of the right solution for your business. So just to introduce you to who you've got on the webinar today. So my name is James Dell. I'm Associate Director and Head of Technical Architecture over here at Planet IT. And I've got Costa joining me today from Sophos. Costa, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself to all of our guests.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, James. Just want to double check that you can hear me okay?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Fantastic. So yeah, good morning, everyone. My name's Costa. I'm a senior sales engineer at Sophos. I've been at Sophos now for just over 3 years. But prior to that, actually was a Sophos customer for a good period of time. I worked in the NHS for about 15 years through a variety of different desktop through to infrastructure and security roles. And it's my pleasure to be joining you guys from Planet IT as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Costa. Great to have you. So all the way through today's event, we have the live Q&A running. So you'll see that on the side of your screen. Feel free to ask any questions you do have at any point through the Q&A. We will get to them when we can. But don't worry about saying something that you're worried you're embarrassing yourself by what you're saying. Everything you put in there goes through to our team internally, and we don't publish anything unless obviously it's appropriate to do so. So we can see the questions, but everyone else in this live event won't necessarily see them. So you can ask whatever you want to, and obviously anything where you mention your business name or products, we'll sanitize that through as we talk about solutions. Today is about being informative for everybody. But yeah, definitely feel free to reach out the whole way through this process and use that Q&A feature. And you'll see that Barry's put some messages in there already for you to show you where it is. Today's a bit different as well because for the first time, we've got a post-webinar survey coming out to all of you. So after we finish today's event, you will receive an email shortly afterwards with a couple of things. It will include the link to this recording, so you'll be able to listen back to anything that we do say today. But it's also for us to gather some information about what you find useful in the webinar and anything that we can do better for next time. And we're actually able to offer a Amazon voucher off the back of completed webinar surveys. So do make sure you do that survey, and then you'll see that that Amazon voucher drop into your inbox shortly afterwards. So that nice little added bonus for joining us today. Now I'm going to start with something, and obviously this is something that we've added into this slide deck. Obviously after creating it, I suppose would be the key to put it. So obviously in light of current events. So in my role here at Planet IT, I've been asked for my advice and guidance on the current global landscape. These questions have always been there, but they've just been forced back to the forefront in the light of current events. I'm not going to talk about the ongoing conflict because I'm far from the right person to talk about this. However, I'm going to talk about the wider effects and the risks which occur because of this situation from a cybersecurity landscape point of view. As you're all aware, there's a fine line between sharing information and knowledge and providing opinion and evidence, which is not fact-based. So anything that we say here is going to be based on the information we do have. I will take a short Q&A directly about this a few moments after I go through these slides and answer any questions specifically around this. I'm not going to answer any questions around specific vendors or products, and I'm sure you understand why I wouldn't do that. So it's important for me to say in these the current circumstances that businesses should be extra vigilant about where their data is stored in the current global circumstances. Now there is a much larger reach than you would expect. There are many major software as a service solutions which leverage globally redundant infrastructure, which should there be a continuation of the currently increasing sanctions, they could become available to all of us in the UK, Europe and the wider world. These may be services that are partially or completely offline by sanctions and the changes, and they could leave your business exposed or offline. I want to say that while I can't name any solutions or platforms or vendors, I would suggest that your business conducts its own research into where your services, your platforms, anything you're using is hosted and where those servers are located, and anywhere that the businesses you're working with or platforms you're working with house data and whereabouts those data centers sit, because that could put you potentially at risk. Obviously, the question of why now, there's been a dramatic increase in cyber attacks hitting Western countries, especially those linked to governments of NATO countries, as well as other infrastructural systems, so train services and power stations, etc. However, the pure nature of cyber attacks is they will never just stop targeting power and water, governments, agencies, all those kind of things. Eventually, they end up hitting organizations across the whole globe. And as such, we need to be aware as businesses of this increased activity and the increased pressure on cybersecurity, the products and the platforms that we use, because the world is getting noisier and these cyber attacks are getting greater. We have to be ever more aware that we're so reliant on the products that we put in front of our systems, and the protection we put in place has to be up to date, it has to be relevant, it has to protect our businesses. Obviously, we need to look at where our products are developed and who are developed by. Obviously, as I mentioned about data location, the same principle applies to developers. If a solution you use or rely on is supported or delivered from an affected region, it could well be in the short term that you lose access to that support, the development of that product, or the continued platform that you're using. This could be due to the sanctions, it could be due to the displacement of people away from their natural working location. But we have to think about the products that we're using and how who's building them and who's developing them will have an effect on us in these current circumstances. Obviously, as I've mentioned, obviously since 2014, there's been a massive increase in cyber attacks, and it's just something that we need to be ultimately aware of, and we need to look at the impact of how those increased attacks will affect our businesses and how we work. And obviously, the final thing to mention in this whole current circumstance is the risk to your potential reputation of your business. If you're associated, with the wrong side of this global circumstances, via a product, a solution, a platform, or something that takes your business offline because you're using a platform or a service that is in one of those affected regions, it could be that you affect your standing with your clients and your suppliers, and it can have a much wider long-term effect on your business. It also could be that certain organizations, frameworks, or governing bodies enforce change upon you, and that could have a reputational damage or an impact on you. So we're unfortunately already seeing this dramatic increase in questions coming around certain verticals where the government, they're working with government contracts or on certain frameworks where certain products are already being blacklisted or suggested that you move away from them, and the damage to that business is that they have to make that quick turnaround, or the reputation of their relationship on that framework or via that government purchasing scheme may be affected. So it's something to think about wider than just the cyber attacks and the where the data is what impact will it have on your business, and what impact could it have on your business long term. So we've talked about the current risks. So what do we do? Well, the first thing is quite simple. It's making sure you have an end-to-end full security stack that covers everything from email, endpoint, ingress and egress of data, to remote working and staff training. If you can put focus on making your system secure, safe, and having a well-trained staff base, you will reduce your risk dramatically. Regardless of what we're looking at in the world of cybersecurity, that will always be true. Secondarily, act early. Don't wait for sanctions or global changes to prevent your systems working or place your data at risk. Complete a review of all your systems and services and take a risk-based review off the back of this, and then make the changes that you believe are right to protect your business, its operations, and its reputation. And then finally, stay up to date and stay informed about the changing landscape and increased risks. Many companies out there in the cybersecurity space have blogs, help pages, dedicated places to go to find additional information. At Planet IT, we share content on our social media all the time around this, and the idea being that we're sharing information that will help you mitigate against these risks. Now, I'm happy to take any questions at this point that anyone has around the couple of slides that we've just had. Obviously, I'm keen to obviously keep this contained, as it were. So first question that's come in is how do we know where companies store their data? So the first thing you can do is the honest thing, which is to ask them. Most companies, most businesses will have a knowledge base or an article or information on their website about where they house or store their data. They may not be specific and say in X city, but they will say in a certain region, and that's for you to then make that decision about whether that region or that area is something that puts your business at risk. So most will have that information publicly, or they may say they use like a larger system like AWS, Azure, or GCP to hold data, in which case you can then look at what regions that exists in. But you can always ask, you have the right to ask that question. Obviously, under data GDPR and data protection rules, you have the right to know where your data is. And next question that's come in is, what should I do if I feel that the product I have is at risk, but I have time left to run on the license? So if you're already in term for a license and you've already purchased a product and you've got a number of years left to run on it, reach out to the likes of Planet IT and to your account manager, and let's look at what the alternatives are, and let's see what those alternative vendors are willing to do to help you through that period. Now, there has been vendors over the last few months which have specifically offered discounts around providing increased discount to cover that cost that you've essentially already spent, or multiple years of free licenses to tie on to an existing deal to cover you for essentially removing that product while you still have time left to run on it. It's always worth asking the question. You don't want to be left at risk just because you've already made a purchase, because it's not going to help you in the long term just by going, well, we've already spent the money, so we have to stick with it. There's always vendors out there that are willing to work with you and willing to find a mid ground, somewhere they can work on a pricing structure that works for you. Perfect. I can't see any more questions coming in, so I will move on. If you do have any additional questions, do feel free to ask them through the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to move on from what we're talking about in terms of the current landscape and look wider picture. So, what does a cyber attack look like in real terms? Now, the reason I highlight all of these stages is this is something that we've seen from the real world and some of the shocking figures that come around it. So, to look at a simple attack chain, the first thing that any attacker is going to do is do their reconnaissance. They're going to look at your system, whether that be an automated vulnerability scan they're going to run against your system, whether that be an eyes on target, whether that's physical reconnaissance and looking at your building security, or sitting to see what you do over weekends and access. They're then going to look at how they deliver that solution into your system and use that reconnaissance to push data in to your network. Now, the first thing is that reconnaissance could take several months, it could take several hours, it could take several minutes. That time frame is completely open. The next two stages with the delivery and installation, now these pieces could happen immediately after reconnaissance, but then nothing continues to happen afterwards. So they've delivered their packetized, their virus, their way in, their door into your system. They're essentially their way to break through your locks. So essentially their lock picking kit. They've delivered that into your system. They've installed it. It's ready to roll. They're ready to attack your system, but they could sit there for a period of time. That period of time, we've seen in certain scenarios, be several months. They wait for an opportune activity. So maybe they wait for a Christmas shutdown. They wait for a period where they know that IT staff are less likely to be looking at systems, so they have the opportunity to jump in and take actions. That's when they'll take that action on objectives they're going to start looking through, and they're going to start weaponizing whatever technology and tools they want to put into your system. So at this point, this will happen very quickly. Stages 1, 2, and 3 could take a long time. Once we start acting on the information, stages 4, 5, 6, and then 7 will happen in a very short space of time. And ultimately, what an attacker is going to be doing once they've done that kind of long period of stages 1 to 3 is they're going to be really getting into your system and getting what they want out of it. Now, we've seen with real world attacks, reconnaissance takes several months, with attackers planning how they're going to exfiltrate this data, how they're going to handle hiding all of the steps that they've taken. And they've sat there, they've been in for months, and then for the stages 4 to 7 happen in 30-40 seconds. They're all their tools are ready to go, and they're literally using their tools, they're doing the weaponization, getting the data they want, taking control, and then the system is theirs. And by that point, obviously, it's too late. What we need to do is make sure that we're stopping people through the chain. I know that Costa's going to come onto that in a minute, but it's interesting to see from my point of view that time scale that goes around this piece. It's not something that happens instantly. It's something that does take a period of time, and obviously it depends what kind of attack they're doing and how automated it is and how manual the process is. There may well be that the kind of attack they're going through is very manual, so the reconnaissance stage takes a lot longer as they're trying to find the right way in to deliver these attacks.
Perfect time for me to chime in here, James. Thank you.
Perfect, yeah.
So I think just to maybe add some further weight to this, one of the things that we of course need to consider is that there has been a large-scale shift in attacks, as we say, away from your traditional spray and pray. And I think one of the biggest still today ransomware breaches that many people think about, due to the fact that it affected so many countries, was of course the likes of WannaCry. Now, WannaCry was, let's be a little bit maybe frank here, bit of an accident. I don't think it was intended to spread the way that it did. Obviously, it was a worm that was able to go across people's local networks and across their private links, etc. But it was very much a bit of a, once it was on the network, it did its own thing. What we've now seen in subsequent years is, as you can see on the left-hand side, some core gangs, as we like to refer to them as. You may be familiar with DarkSide, for example. They were involved in that very large-scale Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, and they took their time to do reconnaissance, as James has just rightly alluded to. And then, of course, when they got to the point when they were delivering the payload, they acted very, very quickly. But the reason why I'm mentioning these on the same slide together with tools and techniques is because the reconnaissance stage, yes, can take a long time, but it's the tools that these guys tend to use on the right-hand side that we would recognize as potentially unwanted applications. Maybe would recognize them as penetration testing tools or similar. But the other thing that we need to consider is that these tools might also involve out-of-the-box operating system tools. And obviously the most common one there would be the likes of PowerShell, WMI, and similar. And they're all very much leveraged when it does come to a gang, once having established a footprint, working their way around your environment. Now, the one thing to consider here, and James, if you wouldn't mind just pressing the tab on to highlight the next part of the slide, I don't think I've got control yet, is actually a big focus on the Conti ransomware gang. These guys form quite a large amount of ransomware attacks that they've been part of in recent years. And so I just wanted to maybe take a step back and talk about them for a moment, especially with the fact that they've had some of their internal communications leaked over the past 12 to 18 months as well. And again, we're doing this with a view of just trying to give you some insight as to how these gangs potentially operate. But just before I do, one really interesting story that I thought I would love to share today with you guys, especially in relation to tools and techniques leveraged by malware gangs and ransomware gangs. There was a customer who came to Sophos and to talk to us about our incident response services known as Rapid Response. What had actually happened was that this customer had an ongoing penetration testing schedule. They were very good on top of their own cybersecurity operations internally. But what actually occurred was that whoever had managed to get into their environment managed to work those patterns out and started to use the same tools that they were using for their penetration testing. So again, it really does shine some light in that we need to be very, very aware of the types of tactics and techniques that these guys can use, especially as these types of attacks become more and more wide scale. I think I can click now, James. Yep, there we go. So with a playbook in mind and with the Conti ransomware gang in mind here, I'd just like to draw your attention to some of the percentages that you can see on the attack chain along this playbook. James mentioned that the first reconnaissance period of time and the initial access stage was where the majority of the attack took place. And actually, if you look where the majority of the percentage of time is spent here for initial access, execution, and establishing persistence, well, in comparison, when we get to lateral movement and exfiltration and actually dropping a payload towards the end, it's a very, very substantial amount of time in comparison. Now, we won't work all our way through all of these different parts of the playbook, but again, whilst we're on the context of Conti, again, this came out due to some of their own internal leaks here. I actually read an article recently about the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, SEPA, who are apparently still seeing ill effects from a Conti ransomware attack that they had in late 2020. So this is why it's not just important to consider the initial impact, but also the long scale impact of things like reputation, long-term cleanup exercises, when we are potentially targeted by such a wide scale ransomware attack. But in the meantime, let's just break this playbook down a tiny bit further. And you'll see coming up on the screen now, we've got a bit more of a breakdown of the types of tools that are potentially leveraged during this type of playbook. And I hope that's visible to everyone, but I just want to start drawing your attention to the execution table. And I think my mouse should be present for you as well. You'll notice PowerShell scripts, PSExec, WMIC. Those are three of the most commonly used tools that we tend to see. And PSExec itself, of course, is a sysinternals Microsoft tool that a lot of vendors will actually block by default. And then a lot of organizations will go and make exclusions for them to use them. And one of the things that I do in my role here at Sophos with Sophos customers is perform regular health checks on people's environments. And this is always a conversational point around the sysinternals tool. So by using this as a bit of an education at this stage, Sophos, for example, blocks the use of PSExec and very many of the other sysinternals and potentially unwanted application type of tools by default. They're picked up, they're put into quarantine so that they can't run, and then it's up to the administrator to make a choice as to whether to release it and allow it to run, or to acknowledge that alert to know that, of course, this has been detected and it has been dealt with. Now, this is a conversational point because for the majority of the health checks that I perform, people have put in exclusions because there are other third-party tools that will leverage PSExec and PSKill as the majority of instances. Now, again, if we're looking at this particular attack chain, if I draw your attention a little bit further across to the right, we'll start seeing PSExec again when it comes to lateral movement. So if we are, for example, taking that stance that we need to use that tool internally, or we have a third-party tool that uses this laterally in our network, maybe it's time to take a bit of a step back and reconsider the use of those types of tools. They may be genuine, but if we're not monitoring how they're being used, as you can clearly see from this playbook breakdown, there's ways that they can be effectively going undetected if you've got those exclusions in your environment. Again, I won't break down all the other aspects in here, but you'll just keep your eye out in the terms of privilege escalation. You can see that there's obviously a number of different tools that are mentioned there. But if we have a look at defense evasion, the GP edit tool might seem like a really silly one, but if somebody has access to your network and they can make changes so that they can hide again, give themselves extra access on the device once they have escalated those privileges. If we continue again over at the discovery piece, root scan, NL test, net commands, net scan, these are probably things that your general IT admin will have used at some point in their life for day-to-day activity. So one of my messages today is very much keeping an eye on and applying the context to the use of these types of genuine tools, because as you can see, they form a very, very important part to how bad guys can get into your network and use those exclusions, use those genuine tools to get to that impact piece at the end to drop a ransomware payload or exfiltrate your data. Now, just whilst we're on the topic of things that have come out of the ransomware playbooks and the like of the Conti leaks, A little bit tongue-in-cheek, this one. You've probably seen this for a few other vendors as well. There's conversational points that have been happening around different AV products as they've been trying to break through them. This was a comment that came straight out of the Conti leaks. What was interesting as well is that they also tried to arrange a demo of the Sophos product. I'm not sure whether they then tried to subsequently buy any of our products from us. But worth noting at this stage that we have completely open and free trials that anybody can start with our product. We've got no concerns there of the product being available for people to use and test out. But I think that this is quite interesting that Sophos eats everything that Conti drops. James, I think we're back over to you at this point. Oh, no, sorry, it's still me. Apologies. I'm trying to look at the slides that are being shared whilst taking control of your screen. My bad. So just to maybe finish my piece off before handing back over to James again. You guys are probably joining thinking, why do we always literally talk about ransomware? And it's been something that has been talked about now for a number of years. And again, it was brought to the fore by WannaCry, for example. But this is just a little bit of an excerpt that was taken from some results that we did from the previous year or so for our incident response service, rapid response, that I just mentioned. And now, if you'll notice, 79% of all the incidents that they responded to was to do with ransomware. And just to be clear, Sophos Rapid Response is something that can be used by non-Sophos customers as well. It's not just a Sophos customer service. So hence we're being able to be called in, as it were, to help organizations who might be going through an active breach. But you'll notice the likes of Cobalt Strike, web shells, they came out from like the proxy exchange vulnerabilities, for example. Still quite a high percentage that's in there, as is coin miners, for example. But there is such a dominance there of ransomware being 79% of what we were helping respond to. Clearly, as we move throughout the rest of 2022, ransomware shows no signs of slowing down. So apologies if it really sounds like we're beating the drum. This is genuinely something that we believe is the right thing to talk about, to educate our customers, our potential customers, and even Joe Blogs on the street so that they know that ransomware is a real thing that can affect anyone and any organization. Now I believe it's right to hand back to you, James.
Yes, thanks, Costa. So I'm going to pivot slightly and talk about this in the real world, because it's all well and good saying, okay, well, ransomware, there's 79%, all those kind of things. People go, well, has it really happened? So this example, this cyber victim, is a real world example. It's something that unfortunately at Planet IT, I was brought in and we were involved in the cleanup of this organization. So we've managed to firsthand get this information. So first of all, it's important to understand where they went wrong. So the organization was hit by a ransomware attack. It was an attack that was manually triggered. So their eyes on target were actually about 5.5 months from initial point of breaking into the system to when they triggered this attack. They waited for a period of intense activity at the organization, so they knew there'd be less IT eyes looking at the system at the time. A very clever tactic of understanding their the target organization in this case. They used ransomware to encrypt and hide themselves on the way out. So essentially, their aim was to get rid of, to exfiltrate data. But what they did was they injected ransomware and some log destruction tools on the way out to make sure that it was very hard to see what they'd taken. It took a long time to get there. So what happened? So 80,000 pieces of personally identifiable information were stolen. They failed because they didn't invest in staff. There was no training for IT staff or staff in general. They had passwords that hadn't been changed on systems for over 5 years. They had no MFA or 2FA on any system. They had systematic failures in IT management. They had a lack of IT security. They had nobody with any information security representation, IT management or anything at board level. Board level was simply, it was people that ran the business. They had no interest in IT, as it were. They'd massively underinvested in IT in general. They had a lack of basic system security. They had products that weren't configured or set up correctly, or products they weren't using that weren't installed across their entire base, but they were licensed for it. It was poor how sort of system keeping health, poor IT health, as it were. They had a firewall which was completely misconfigured, and it might as well have not been there. It was essentially any traffic coming straight through, no protection at all. the system breaches, actually, there have been records going over 12 months of people poking their head in to look at their system before this major attack happened. And the actual IT team itself had no cybersecurity experience at all. There was not a single person in their IT team that had any form of experience of cybersecurity, had any training or any understanding really of what was required. So that's where they went wrong. But I suppose the real question is, what did it cost them? Well, it cost them £200,000 just to get the system back up and running. And that was on emergency engineers, it was on time, it was on kit that was needed to get them operational again. It was costing them around £3,300 a day in losses for the system outages. At the end of all of it, they got a massive fine from the ICO of £150,000, which obviously doesn't help. The initial attack itself cost them £450,000. So they dropped that money essentially in the space of about 4 weeks. That had to come out of the business somewhere. It was nearly £2 million, the total cost for the entire attack, end to end, including everything. But the most important thing for me is that cyber insurance did not pay out. They had cyber insurance, but it was not covered because of all the points that I mentioned on the previous slide. It was a decision of the insurers that they were negligent in the delivery of their duty, and therefore the insurance was invalid, essentially. So, this is what I'm coming on to, is the importance of cyber insurance is massively important to every business in 2022, but it's no good having that if you've got the chocolate fire guard behind it. They're not going to warranty your insurance if you're not doing it. And this organization, ultimately, I suppose, for anyone who's joining this call who is, a non-IT person or a director or a business owner, it's important to know that this organization actually went bust, essentially, got taken over by another organization because financially, after this had all been done and the insurance didn't pay out, they had no money left, and they essentially were swallowed up by another organization, and essentially continue to operate, but as part of that other organization. The entire senior management and board level were all dismissed on the same day as a direct response to what happened. So that's the real world term of it. The IT team didn't get dismissed. The IT team stayed in post, regardless of the fact that they hadn't done their job properly. From an organizational point of view, it was the senior managers that were ultimately responsible as far as that business was concerned. So it's important to say that, in terms of, we're not looking at it and saying, okay, well, just because you're, the IT manager, you're ultimately responsible. But because if you've told the business to invest and to do these things, they haven't done it, then ultimately that's a business level decision.
And I guess just to continue that theme as well, many of you on the call may well have heard that at some point last year, the Irish Health Service was also hit by a ransomware attack. Funnily enough, also Conti. But I brought this back to the table today from a conversational perspective because the US Health and Human Services Department decided to do a bit of an audit here for themselves so that they can understand what kind of lessons could be learned and drawn out. And although there's no real facts and figures here involved in costs, there was, of course, the fact that humans were put at risk here due to this being a health service. And this can be the same, anything from suppliers of food, supermarkets and similar. The reality is there's a lot more impact than just the costs that are potentially involved. But yeah, I guess just to bring this one to your attention, the reason why I wanted to talk about it again, one of the quotes that came out of the US Health and Human Services was that the Cobalt Strike beacons that Conti had deployed on May the 7th were detected by their existing vendor-based solution, and the alerts were ignored. So if we think about my previous slides with regards to how a Conti playbook happened, one of the things that they do at the very beginning is drop a few payloads basically to see what gets responded to. And if they see that the things that they're dropping are being effectively ignored, they may well just say, well, fair game. We've got a bit more of a chance here as opposed to just worrying about being blocked at the door. Now, the other side of this that very much comes back to what James was just talking about was that the HSC didn't have a centralized cybersecurity function. They didn't have a single responsible owner for cybersecurity at a senior or exec level. And actually what this led to was, of course, that the impact of the ransomware that had stopped patient healthcare within Ireland, and 80% of their data was encrypted, because at the time and potentially still today, they were running predominantly on-prem, with a lot of their exchange services on-prem as well. So really quite serious instances here. And again, I know it sounds like we're beating the ransomware all doom and gloom drum. It is worth also noting at this stage that there are hundreds, thousands of success stories battling against ransomware, where products have done their job and services and the teams have done a great job of battling and seeing ransomware out. But these big name ones are still very, very important for us to draw and learn lessons from. And on that note, I did just mention some supermarkets, so changing the tone a little bit, and I hope some of you might play along here. I would like for you to play a bit of Spot the Difference in the chat. And obviously we've got Spar and Sainsbury's on the screen. So the obvious one is that they're both supermarkets and similar. But Barry, I guess I know you're passing things through from the Q&A, but I want to see if there's anybody who is potentially going to spot some differences between these two, or similarities. And I'll give it a few seconds.
See if everyone's being shy or not. That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah. I tell you what, I'll give the most obvious one away. They're both supermarkets. They both sell food. I think the second most obvious one, if my click will go through to the screen, is that they were victims of ransomware, but they were victims of ransomware that didn't hit them directly. Again, I'll see if there is anybody putting anything in the chat. I think we might have a shy audience, so I'll just come out with it. So these guys were not directly hit by ransomware, but their supply chains were. So Spar's supply chain, they had a distributor for food called James and Hall, and through that supply chain attack, it affected Spar's payment card system. Sainsbury's were hit by something called the Ultimate Kronos Group, that hit, via the Ultimate Kronos Group, which was the payroll services that were provided to Sainsbury's, so they were unable to pay their staff for a short period of time. Now, without wanting to overstate the obvious here, there was risks involved, and money, of course, was involved at this point. But the thing that I wanted to use this as a conversational point around was supply chain. We can do as much as possible to ensure that our defenses are good and watertight, but there's no overstating here that auditing your supply chain is extremely important. And in fact, we should really move away from a tick box exercise of, are they Cyber Essentials certified and similar? We shouldn't be afraid to ask some really serious and strong questions around what they are actually literally doing to ensure that their best security posture is in place. Because ultimately, if we're working with an organization, maybe we've got a private link to them, maybe some of them have got access to some of our software via VPN, maybe software as a service. The reality is, if they get breached, it can affect you and your reputation too. So just wanted to use that as a very, very light conversational point. The next one, and again, I'm hoping somebody plays along, spot the difference between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Sainsbury's don't charge for a trolley. That just came through. Thank you, Mr. Anonymous. That's quite funny. So this one here, 2020, obviously, start of COVID, we had a massive, shall we say, shortage of toilet roll. And then earlier this year, KP Snacks were hit by ransomware and they had to cease production of nuts. So again, very, very tongue-in-cheek here, guys, with lack of toilet roll in 2020 due to a global pandemic versus a ransomware attack affecting our food. But again, it just goes to show the real world effects. And it's why, again, we continue to have these conversations about ransomware, because it can truly affect our day-to-day lives in ways that we've never maybe considered before. James, I think back to you at this point. Well, in fact, I'll ask this. It's a bit of a query. We were going to do this as a poll, but Teams doesn't allow us to do a poll. So this is a bit of a open question. Again, you don't feel free to have to put any details. You can reply anonymously. But the idea here is that we're about to start talking about cybersecurity. So it'd be really good to know if you guys have renewed your cybersecurity insurance in the last 12 months, planning to renew in the next 6 months. Maybe you've made some claims on your cybersecurity insurance recently. And again, not asking for any disclosures here. Maybe you don't have cybersecurity insurance cover today because you've got other solutions in place. It'd be really interesting to hear what you guys have got in relation to the question being posed here.
For those of you who are looking at the Q&A, Barry's just put a question you can actually respond to in there, so just give your answers through. We're seeing some trickle through, people renewed in the last 12 months.
Okay, that's always good news.
Yeah, people, a lot of people saying renewed in the last 12 months, quite a few renewed in the next 6 months, couple coming through that have no cover. Yes, it's moving quicker than I can see now. That's a
yeah, they're scrolling up the page. So I guess the idea here is that it's something that most people here have considered and have either recently renewed or and there's a few that potentially have no cover here. I guess it'd be really interesting to understand those anonymous replies with regards to D, as to maybe why you don't have any cover. And it's maybe not something we'll talk about directly now, but it would just be good for us to know conversationally and maybe something we can pick up at the end of the call. Thanks for everybody who's participated. That's really useful to hear. So I guess, James, again, at this point, over to yourself.
Yeah, so for me, coming directly off of what Costa's just been talking about, not all cyber insurance is the same. And I suppose when I asked Barry to put this slide together for me, I said I want things that aren't the same, and he's done quite a good job of finding me some images. So we are that kind of that iOS versus Android, butter versus margarine, Pepsi versus Coke. Cyber insurance, just because you've got cover doesn't mean you're going to be covered for the same thing as another business and you're in the same sector as you, or even another business with the same provider as you. A lot of the time, cyber insurance is driven by what protection you have in place. So what investment your business has placed on protecting yourself, what certifications you've done, whether you've done Cyber Essentials, Cyber Essentials Plus, whether you're ISO certified. A lot of those factors will come into it. The point I wanted to make with this slide really is the most important thing is to understand what you are covered for, because when it all goes wrong, which we're saying, hopefully it will never happen to you, but if it does, the last thing you want to do is call up your cyber insurance company and they go, yeah, really sorry, we're not covered for that. Likewise, you need to understand what their expectations are. Going back to our cyber victim, one of the things that hurt them majorly was, as part of the terms and conditions of their cyber insurance, all response to a cyber attack had to be delivered, managed, and vetted by a third party. So they had to appoint a third party to go through and do that remediation and to help the business get back on its feet. But that support wasn't available for 72 hours, and it was in the terms. It was when you have a cyber attack, essentially your business has to shut down for 72 hours. Then we send a team out to help you. In the first 72 hours, we just do calls to understand how bad the attack is. For most organizations, you couldn't be offline for 72 hours unless it's a weekend, or you can take that hit. Imagine having no IT systems for that period of time. So it's really important that you understand what your cyber insurance covers you for and what you'd expect it to cover you for. Is it going to give you full kit replacement should your kit be damaged by a cyber attack and be unrepairable? Is it going to give you loan equipment to get your business up and running whilst investigation work takes place on your existing hardware? It's really important to understand what that cyber insurance bubble gives you, and if it's the right one for you. And there's a lot of different people out there offering those, and I'm not advocating for any one, but it needs to be the right one for your business. And that's what I'm saying, is make sure you're looking and comparing every time you go for that renewal. It may be the same company you've always used, but is that the right protection for your organization?
And I think this is something that we also need to consider, is that with cyber insurance, there are often instances where it might be a simple tick box exercise just to say that you have got it. And again, this is why it's a really important conversational topic for us, because there may be expectations that cyber insurance has that you maybe not considered. For example, when and why they may or may not pay out is, of course, a very important one. Having insurance is ultimately there to save us when things go wrong. So does it include incident response? Does it include a certain solution that we have to work with, or are we allowed to pick our own vendors and solutions? So there is a lot to consider when we do have a look at cybersecurity insurance and make sure that we're not just doing it just to say that we're compliant. And again, really just tying back to some of the comments James were making here. Hiscox here, this was a claim or a quote from last year from within their policies. Notice that they do not pay out for claims, losses, breaches, etc., due to the use of any outdated or unsupported software or systems. Now, I'll let you consider the potential implications there. Does that include Windows 7? Does that include Server 2008 R2, non-R2? There's a lot of things that could be considered into scope here, even as far back as older versions of Adobe, or something that isn't patched completely up to date today or at the point there was a breach. So the use of any outdated or unsupported software or systems needs to be something that we really focus on and consider how that might affect us with our cybersecurity insurance. Again, tiny little bit tongue-in-cheek here. You guys may have heard this last year as well. AXA famously were hit by a big ransomware attack themselves in their APAC region, not long after they released a statement saying that they'll no longer be paying ransoms when their customers are hit. So again, it goes to show it can happen to anybody, and we are ultimately all moving targets because the bad guys want to make money out of us. And if insurance stops paying, in which case like AXA did, they put themselves as a bit of a target because the bad guys wanted to continue making money out of potentially either cybersecurity insurance payments or from the guys paying up who are being affected. Now, cybersecurity insurance has been a huge conversational topic for me and my customers in the past year, and I guess it's why we again wanted to bring this as a conversational point. And it's also why we asked you the questions about how you've renewed recently or whether you're looking to renew. What I've seen in the last 12 months is that there is more and more onus on the customers or the organizations to have, for example, MFA enabled, to have EDR tool sets, and then some of the basics like email and web filtering security. These went from some nice to haves, as you can see with some of the blue aspect. These aren't requirements, but they are some nice to haves. And EDR is one of the big talking points because for a lot of organizations, they look at an EDR tool and think, unless I've got somebody to sit and use it and to make use of it, it's a bit of a pointless spend, but I'll go and buy it because I need to tick my cybersecurity insurance tick box. Some cybersecurity insurers now are saying that if you have an EDR solution, you need to prove how it's being used for forensic purposes, what investigations, what teams are using it. And so hence there has also been a huge steer in the last 12, 18 months towards managed detection and response services as opposed to an outright product. But again, what I find interesting here is that the bits in blue are, of course, nice to haves. But notice this is, of course, a different cybersecurity vendor, Marsh McLennan here. End of life systems need to be replaced or protected. Nice to have. It's not a full-on requirement, for example. You don't need to have a full-on incident response plan. It's a potentially nice to have here. Really, I view everything on that screen as if your insurance is asking for it in some way, shape, or form, then it should be something that our organization is considering the hows and do's of all of those requirements listed there.
So really, I just wanted to come on to, we've talked about the cyber insurance, we've talked about the threat landscape. And now I just wanted to mention something that comes up a lot for me, which is when we're talking to customers and they say, well, I've got an endpoint protection product. Well, this slide, I'm not going to go through all of these things on here. This is the reason that traditional signature-based endpoint protection on its own is no longer enough. You know, those products, while they will do a great job when it's something we know about and something that we've already dealt with in some form, as you know, in the cybersecurity world, if it's anything else on that page, it's not touching it. So if it's ransomware, a traditional endpoint protection product isn't going to do that. You need something that's got the ability to look at behavior. If we're talking about, you know, vulnerabilities, you know, a traditional endpoint is not going to look at vulnerabilities like the log4j vulnerability. It doesn't care about that. All it cares about is I've got a list of signatures, a list of things I know are bad, and this is what I'm checking against. the landscape is moving so much away from that functional kind of, oh yeah, well I have an endpoint protection product, to, yeah, well, what else are you doing? How are you looking at the data that's coming from that? How are you using AI and machine learning to protect on top of those things? Who's ultimately responding and reacting to these, the risks, the alerts, all things we're seeing? Because as Costa mentioned, when we're talking about attacks that have really happened, if we've not looked at them and the alerts are sat there, then it's pointless having them. You ultimately just go, oh, we're ticking a box. We've got all the alerts, so we know when it went wrong. Yeah, well, that's useful, isn't it? It doesn't help protect the business. So these, this myriad of things that exist in this kind of threat landscape. These are just a few of them that we could get on a slide. All those things that are out there, misconfiguration being a really obvious one. That a traditional endpoint product, if it's not set up properly, it's misconfigured, it's going to be useless. And that's what happened to our cyber victim. Was misconfiguration was the open door that allowed all the rest of these things to take place. So it's just something to be aware of. And when we say we're talking about EDR products, and we're talking about MTR and NDR, it's because these traditional products are no longer really up to the job.
Thanks, James. And yeah, I think we'll talk about this one very briefly, but I think the idea that we've been trying to get across so far is that actually the way that we work has very much changed. And so in relation to how the threat landscape has changed, it also means that the bad guys will be doing a lot more differently, as well as we've already quite heavily touched on today. And so again, I won't talk too heavily on these particular slides, but there are some interesting bits that I just wanted to draw everybody's attention to. These particular stats and figures at the top of this slide come from a survey that Sophos do once a year. We call it the State of Ransomware, where we effectively employ a third party to go and speak to up to about 5,500 different organizations to see how they've got on with their variety of different products and what they have experienced. So these are non-Sophos customers in these particular instances. But you'll notice that the stats here are quite heavy hitting. 37%, according to our own survey, of organizations were hit by ransomware. So, let's call that a third. And more than half of those IT teams that were queried said that the attacks now are deemed too advanced for just your standard IT team. And again, I think that really matches up with what we've been talking about here. We've gone from malware being dropped, the spray and pray approach, to people who are genuinely trying to get into and sit on your network. And actually, on the dark web, there is a lot of sales of services going on here, where these ransomware gangs are working together so that they can infiltrate environments. And again, maybe slightly tongue-in-cheek here, we saw recently in the news last week around some teenagers in Oxford who spent their time working on trying to get into Okta and to Microsoft. It just goes to show that people are trying to see these as easy avenues of making money. Okay, I say easy with, again, very tongue-in-cheek here. It's very much not easy to breach these organizations' defenses, but there's a lot of money involved. And this is why there is a big shift to more and more organizations, crime organizations, being involved in cyber warfare, as it were. Now, just focusing on the 54% of attacks being too advanced for an IT team alone. One of the things that I love to talk about is what is known as the pyramid of pain. Now, as this builds out, we're starting from the top where things are difficult all the way down to aspects that are considered quite simple and trivial. But if we've got 50-odd% of organizations saying that it's too hard, or the attacks that are coming through are now too difficult for them to manage, well, you'd imagine that they're probably now looking at those tools that we were talking about earlier being leveraged. So trying to understand whether those are legitimate use, or indeed whether it's an active adversary that's using those tools in their environment. There's tools, tactics, and procedures right at the very top. We've got the likes of the cyber kill chain, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which, as we know, has got many entries of different techniques that good and bad software leverages, for example. So trying to understand the context around what happens with those in people's environments is very difficult. So if we maybe take a step back and ask ourselves a very simple question, really. If we're looking at the bottom piece, hash values, IP addresses, it should be relatively easy for us and our products to tell us whether access to those domains, those files, those applications, things that we would traditionally have signatures for, we should be able to recognize those quite easily to know whether they're good or bad. But as we get towards the top of the chain, how do we recognize whether there's genuine use of something like PowerShell, remote desktop being used in our environment? Have we opened RDP for everybody to use, or has somebody started using it because they found that it was open, and so they're using it to hop from endpoint to endpoint, for example? Again, nearly 60% of organizations said that attacks are too complicated. So we really need to be taking this as a bit of a consideration as to coin a phrase here, shift left on our security, because looking at those playbooks earlier on, the things that we could stop as early as possible, yes, they might be tough and difficult, but given the amount of time, reconnaissance, and effort that goes into those early part of the attack chains, if we're focusing a bit of attention there rather than being reactive once we start seeing very large payloads or infiltration, exfiltration of data taking place, then of course it gives us a much better opportunity to play defense as opposed to play reactive, which is potentially paying for bills, shutting down services, restoring from backups. So with that in mind, let's maybe take a 10,000 foot view of what we'd consider as yesterday's solution to this. And this will start to make a little bit more sense as we go through this. But obviously, James and I have been talking around a lot of scenarios. And in the majority of these scenarios, there was potentially a lot of disparate tools. James mentioned in his particular use case, there was a firewall that wasn't configured. There was a lack of MFA. There was a lack of security as a high level. There, as everybody may experience on this call, there are plenty of pieces of software that we have that simply don't talk to each other, that we have no visibility over. And therefore, when it comes to making changes, if we go to the top right-hand corner here, we look at a lot of manual processes to make changes or run investigations. Therefore, back bottom left-hand corner, going on what we were talking about earlier, we now move more to reactive instead of proactive because we are behind in the tooling that we potentially use. And I'm not, of course, saying that's the case for everybody that's on this call, but this is a bit of a generalization at this stage. And of course, ultimately, what does that end up doing for us? Well, if we don't have the resource, things get left behind. HSC, of course, health service, didn't have people looking at their alerts that were being triggered. So when it came to the remediation, third parties were brought in to help remediate. And of course, that is very, very resource intensive. And if we consider some of the approach, summarizing some of those different toolings and similar that I've just mentioned, and I will load this slide out. I thought it was one click to load them all. Oh, sorry, James, could you press back on your keyboard? Thank you very much. And you know, if we consider this as a bit of a cybersecurity journey, if we start at the very top left-hand side, a lack of integration, we may still have very disparate tools that don't communicate with each other. We then therefore may have to take a lot of that process on manually, which of course leads to a shortage of skills if somebody who's been working on a system for 20 years decides to leave, for example. Or unfortunately, and as we've seen in the last 2 years, becomes unwell. As we move up towards the top of this curve, there is of course now a natural desire for a lot of organizations to go and take advantage of software as a service solutions. Your HR department or your finance team might go, actually, I can just buy that from an app store. I can go and buy that from AWS Marketplace. I won't even consult IT, for example. And so now we've got distributed users who have more control potentially over solutions that we weren't aware of. And so when we come to the end of this potential thought chain, have we genuinely improved security outcomes, even if we've started to use more modern software, if they're still lacking integration, if we're still none the wiser about all the software and solutions that are being used in our environment? So coming back to what I was saying earlier with a view of trying to shift left, as it were, I think there's some good best practices that we can take to employ that on the theme of what we're talking about can hopefully help us steer away from ransomware type of attacks or similar. Now, some of these are really straightforward. Employ best practices. Well, I talked about supply chain earlier. The concept of zero trust is obviously now coming to the forefront for zero trust networking access. But if we use zero trust as a concept for everything, including our supply chain, make sure that we qualify everything and everyone that has access to our environment. If we can employ best practice to reduce our attack surface, close off network ports, don't have a firewall that's just open for any, for example, like James's example. Make sure that we are using MFA, make sure that we are patching. Patching is still one of our worst enemies. Having a good patch routine is paramount. It was paramount 20 years ago. It's still paramount today. But really and truly, we need to have visibility of our environment, our own software inventories, our own users, our own data, where it's all kept. If we can't see it, we can't secure it. Take note of current trends. Well, you're all on today's session really to talk about and experience ransomware in the real world, and hopefully we've been able to bring some of that to your attention so far. But really, we need to be constantly keeping up with trends to make sure that we're not missing something. If somebody in the same sector as us or vertical as us experiences a breach and it's well publicized, maybe if it's not all that well publicized, we should be doing our research to see how that could potentially affect us if we're in a similar sector. And of course, there is a lot of tooling that might be involved here. So if we're looking to bring our security all the way back left, we need to have tools in place such as multi-layered defenses, such as email and phishing security attacks protection, such as mobile security to protect us against links that might be sent to us via text, via Facebook or WhatsApp messenger services. We need to have full coverage across all the devices and users that have got access to our resources. Now, naturally, tools here have become a very, very big part of what people are looking to strive to do from a security aspect. Prevention is always better than cure, but the whole reason an EDR XDR solution was born is because that no security product is completely infallible. And so with that in mind, when we do consider the use of EDR tools, as we talked about from a cybersecurity insurance perspective, let's try not to do that from a purely tick box exercise. Let's make sure that what we're investing into is something that we can genuinely use day to day. And if it's not something that we can use, consider potentially outsourcing some of that so somebody can monitor your environment 24/7. We know these attacks don't take place in the middle of the day. They tend generally to happen when it's quiet time for those businesses involved. Now, with that in mind, I thought it'd be a good opportunity just to consider some threat detection and response how-tos. Now, these have been broken down into 5 potentially very simple steps here, and some of them we've already talked about in a fashion today so far. Prevention, as we said, is always better than cure. And just because we know that no product is infallible shouldn't mean that we don't have a product there in the first place. Similarly, patching, just because we know that we are going to be vulnerable at something at some stage doesn't mean that we ignore patching. Because if we are completely patched, then those vulnerability doors are closed. Point 2, if we're collecting data, it needs to be something that firstly is relevant to us and something that provides all information of what we're concerned about. It's no good having an Internet of Things device connected somewhere on your network that you're not aware of. IoT devices can be protected as well, whether they are Linux based or otherwise. Often it's something that we can secure even with a simple network firewall IPS rule, for example. Prioritization, well, it's all well and good collecting countless bits of data, but we need something or someone to be able to prioritize that data. As technology has shifted very much to AI-based solutions, it's still important, in my opinion, to be able to have that human who can still apply that context, whether that's an individual that works at your organization, whether that's a team of organization specialists, or indeed, whether that's a third-party outsourced service here to be able to prioritize the events that are being seen in your environment. But those first 3 things all ultimately come down to whether we can perform points 4 and 5. If we've been able to see early indicators of attack on our prevention products, if we've been able to prioritize that log ingestion, we can then truly take contextualized investigations at point 4 to work out whether or not we need to be in a position to take action. Action might well be as simple as, well, that website was deemed as malicious on one solution. Why aren't I going to then go and deliberately add it to my firewall, my endpoint web security solution to ensure that it is blocked at that level as well? And if we think about my whole shift left concept that I've mentioned a few times now, if we've got those things as early as possible in place, then we can, of course, make sure that we're stopping things as early as possible in that threat chain where a lot of the bad time is spent, as it were. Now, kind of relating this to that how-to, these are some really good questions that I think that we can consider. And again, we won't spend time going through all of this in depth, and we'll make sure that we, when we share the recording, of course, take some time to consider the questions that are on here. But ultimately, those 5 points that I just mentioned on the previous slide, they will give us an indication as to what an attacker was looking to try and do, what tools they were using, what they were targeting. But the big one for me is at the bottom is whether they were able to establish some sort of persistence. If somebody has got into your environment, the likelihood is they've tried to create a backdoor for themselves to get back in, whether that is a means of capturing credentials, whether that's means of installing a remote tool solution, opening RDP, installing something like TeamViewer. They will establish persistence with a view that if they get kicked out, they want to get back in to carry on doing what they were doing. So with all the things that we've taken in mind, there is a constant virtuous cycle of improvement that we can take to learn from the types of detections and investigations that we run within our own environment. And if we do so, then we move more towards what I would deem as today's solution when it comes to threat hunting and dealing with threats that we see in the world today. I've talked about, again, some of these already, so I won't take time to go through them again in lots of depth here, but visibility, ultimately, if we can't see it, we cannot secure it. And if seeing it means having different layers of protection against a lot of our different attack surfaces, so be it. Those are very, very important. At the end of the day, if somebody's accessing our data from their mobile phone and we don't know about that, then how can we possibly secure against it? The context on the right-hand side of this virtuous circle is extremely important. We can capture too much data. We can have things that don't mean anything to us to the point where those alerts and that data just gets ignored. All we'd potentially be doing is adding more hay to that haystack that we're trying to find that needle within. And this, again, looks at tools and solutions and humans to apply that context. And this is where AI can really help us with some of that targeted context to help us speed up those investigations. And that really ties in nicely with the bottom left-hand piece as well, threat intelligence. Sessions like today hopefully are useful to inform you guys about the types of trends that we are seeing, types of gangs that you've maybe never heard of, types of solutions that you've maybe never heard of. But this should really be forming our part of our day-to-day activity as an IT provider or as a service that we're looking at to secure. Because if we're not aware of the things that are happening, it's the same as not having visibility of what's going on in our environment as well. And I think most importantly, if there's a lesson that we can learn here, out of everything that we do, even if we are a few steps behind on our cybersecurity journey, I think an incident response plan now is paramount. If we do not have one, if we do not have people who are able to respond on our behalf, internally or externally, now is the time to seriously start looking at incident response services, whether you bring those in on a retainer, whether you have those on as a regular service that you've got in place for 12 to 36 months, or whether you start building that yourself. An incident response plan really is a huge part on what we need to be doing today. And it might even start as something as simple as one of the Sophos provided ones that you can see here, where there's simply 10 key stages that we can consider. And some of them are really obvious, identifying our assets, and some of them are a little bit more onerous, such as running the tabletop exercises. But the reality is, if we do follow this type of framework, if we do have something like this in place, if we are running regular tabletop exercises, then it means that we can get to a point where our internal analysts and our internal staff who maybe are a little bit lack of exposure to incident response and cybersecurity, this can help them learn and build and help them become battle hardened. The last thing you want is for somebody to have to get to the point where they need to respond when it's critical. So again, following the likes of tabletop exercises and establishing the one next to that, point 8 for response actions, is really, really important. But this, I think, also brings me to a very important part of this conversation as well, which is number 10. If we don't have the resource, time, and maybe, let's be blunt here, the skill set or the desire to have a cybersecurity skill set within our organization, we should really consider the option to hire a managed security service. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the Sophos one later on, but the idea here is that number 10 should be, actually, for me, maybe a little bit further back in that framework. If we can't do any of the tabletop exercises, should we be bringing in services provided by MSSPs to do this on our behalf? If we can't determine an inventory in our environment, again, maybe we employ somebody to come in and run those exercises for us so that we know what we've got and what we need to protect. But more importantly, if we're getting to the point where we are under attack, or if we are unsure, there's got to be somebody that you can turn to, either as that constant outsourced MDR service or as an incident response service, to be able to assist you when things are critical. The last thing you want is to get to the point where your data is exfiltrated, and before you know it, it's costing you hundreds of thousands of pounds to resolve, potentially pay more in fines and similar. I think, James, we're handing back over to you for a moment at this stage, aren't we?
Yeah, nice, easy slide for me. Thank you very much. So something that I get asked quite a lot of the time is, we talk about, and I know Costa's going to talk about it, the Sophos managed threat response. But then obviously the kind of industry term for managed detection and response, that kind of managed SOC service. Now, I just put a slide up because I want it to be really simple and kind of demystify all this. And essentially, MTR from Sophos is an MDR solution. It's just marketing branding. And I'm allowed to say that because I don't work for Sophos. I'm allowed to say it's just marketing. But don't get confused by all these acronyms. As we know, IT, we love an acronym, and we love to make things more complicated than they need to be. But when we're talking about, taking that to the next level, where you've got experts who understand how to threat hunt, how to deal with real world problems, and what happens when we do get threat actors on our system, and other vendors will refer to it as an MDR solution. When we're talking in the Sophos world, we're talking about MTR. So I just wanted to put that real simple slide up to make sure that everyone knew what we were talking about, because I knew otherwise I'd get a lot of questions at the end with people being a bit confused.
And don't worry, James, I call it a marketing term as well.
That's all good there. So I suppose really what I wanted to come on to now was kind of from my background, obviously being an IT manager, why an MTR solution is so important in the real world. This isn't, this is me looking at it from kind of, if it's my system, why do I want it? So you want the recognition from your insurance. Obviously, we've talked about cyber insurance will recognize the fact that you have threat hunters that are looking at your system. You can't necessarily do that with the team you have. So if you don't have the skills in house, you don't have a threat hunting team in house, then looking at a solution like an MTR or from Sophos is obviously critical. But you can't be everywhere. Like, even if I was thinking about my last job as an IT manager, I would have needed 3 threat hunters working on shift patterns, working 24/7, eyes on systems all day. But they still can't be everywhere. That's 3 people to look at an organization of 20,000 people. I'm going to be going, right, I need a team of 8 or a team of 10. Suddenly, that cost is astronomical for a business. You just can't be everywhere. So that's where these solutions come in. You got to think about the small versus the big picture. I know that threat hunting is massively important in what we're talking about today. We're talking about cybersecurity, but in an IT department, you're probably spinning 20, 30 different plates. So you need someone that can look at that threat landscape and say, right, okay, well, what we're seeing on your system, this is actually the big risk. This is what we should be looking at. This is what we're resolving, and not getting lost in the minutiae, where if it's not what you do all day, every day, you can very quickly get lost in that kind of the small picture versus the big picture world. Obviously, doing it yourself, it can be massively expensive. It's expensive if it goes wrong, and it's expensive if you've got to bring the staff in to do it. Like, being honest with you, a threat hunter is not a cheap salary. We're not looking at spending £20,000 and getting an apprentice in off the street. We're talking about someone who's got skills, understanding, experience. That's going to cost you money, and that's obviously not necessarily something that you can just automatically swallow up in your IT budget for additional staffing. Plus, if I'm going to get staff in, how long is it going to take me to train them? Like, if I get someone in who is maybe not as experienced, what's the time between me getting them in the door to them really being effective? That upskill time is probably 9 to 18 months to get them really trained up on using the right tools and being ready to go. Realistically, by that point, things have probably gone wrong, and you've probably had to pay additional money elsewhere to try and backfill the issues you've got, and it has more costs. And then we end up with this continuous cycle of, the skills, the training cost us more money, and then once we've skilled them up, they're going to want more salary because there'll be able to go and get a job elsewhere. So therefore, suddenly we've created ourselves our own problem. As I mentioned, 24/7 coverage is what you need. Let's be honest, if you're looking at threats, the guy that's hacking your system isn't doing it at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday. They're going to wait until you haven't got people looking at the systems, you're not focused on it. They're going to do it over Christmas. They're going to do it at times where you want to be hands-off tools. But if you want to cover it, you've got to do 24/7. You need a minimum of 3 people to do that shifting, and that doesn't cover you for any sickness or any holidays. That's then 5 people. Suddenly that's a very big team you need, and depending on how big your organization is, taking that to senior management, to your directors, your owners, and saying, right, I need to spend in excess of £150,000 on staff to cover just our threats, they're going to just laugh you out of the room. It's not going to go down very well. I know, a bit of a joke, but obviously the one reason that you look at an MTR solution is that inner piece. I know that from being on the other side of the fence where you guys are sat today, that it's a very stressful job. You're looking at a million things, spinning a lot of plates. You can't be focused on that security. If you are focused on it, your hair's going to fall out. You end up looking as bold as I do, because you're just worrying about those problems. Realistically, a solution like an MTR or an MDR solution, the idea is you're taking that stress away. You're ultimately making it someone else's problem, which sounds a bit cliched, but why would you not do that if you could do that? And I suppose we have got a little video to show you later on where we speak to one of our customers about this, and that's one of the reasons that they chose a solution, was because realistically they don't want to work over Christmas, and they didn't want their team being called because they had issues, and they went for Sophos' MTR solution and actually had some interesting activity over that Christmas period that the service picked up and dealt with, and the IT manager didn't even have to look at it. So he was very happy about that. Back to you, Costa. Actually, this is the video, isn't it? So I do apologise. This is actually the I will play this for you guys. It's just a few minutes, and this is just me having a conversation with a customer who's just recently, in the last sort of 7-8 months, moved across to using Sophos' MTR solution and just getting a bit of an understanding of the real world for them. So I will play this video for you now. I suppose the place to start, Dan, would be as why you chose to go down the route of Sophos MTR and the benefits you think it's hopefully bringing to your organisation.
We went for the Sophos MTR because we needed that security partner who could provide that 24/7, 365 support to go through and secure our environment. We've had a look at various different options over the last few years as to how we can almost have that virtual SOC running for the trust. We were struggling to find anybody who could really provide that 24/7, 365 support at a suitable cost that we could go through and actually say, yes, this is going to do the job. It's going to provide the support. We've got the guarantees there. And that's where the Sophos MTR really went through and sat for us and provided exactly what we wanted.
And since it's been in place, you guys have been happy with the service you're getting, and it's all working. You've had no problems with it. It just kind of happens in the background.
Yeah, that's it. It just sits in the background. It runs along. We get a weekly and monthly report to go through and say what Sophos MTR have gone through and picked up. And touch wood, we've been safe and secure ever since.
No worries. And I suppose from the pre-engagement piece, how was working with Planet coming into the kind of Sophos space? Because obviously I know you've worked with other Sophos partners in the past, and we have a bit of a different approach. How did that work for you? Did you find that to be beneficial, the way that we work, and did you find that we were helping you get the most from it, or was it something that you found that you were still doing a lot of the research yourself?
No, I think that's where Planet really went through and provided us with the advantage there, that they were able to go through and shine a light on the finer details instead of going through and just having the marketing information that would come out of any provider, not just Sophos, anybody. And they could give us the exact information and say, look, this is the reality of what the product will go through and provide, not the marketing of just this is what it's going to provide. We know it goes through and works. This is who we can go through and put you in touch with as to who's gone through and using this and how they've found it.
Definitely. I suppose question that I get asked a lot is about network traffic that comes off the back of this. You haven't seen a massive upheaval in network traffic since it's been put in place versus what you had before, which was the Sophos InterceptX product?
No, we have not seen any increase in traffic whatsoever. We've not been actively monitoring, but we've not seen any increase in the traffic whatsoever. We've not had any issues with increased resource usage on the client computers or anything like that. Yeah, it's just nobody's really noticed, to be perfectly honest. The end user would be completely unaware that there's been any change.
And so from your point of view, you've not had to reach out to the MTR team to do anything for you because it's all happening. Are you getting the reports and seeing what they are doing and seeing the alerts that have been dealt with? Is that feel more confident for you knowing that that's taken care of?
Oh, definitely. It's nice to go through and see that there's things being picked up. I think we'd be worried if there wasn't things being picked up. But yeah, we get that weekly, monthly report to go through and say, yeah, we've got this this number of events over the last week or month, depending on the report, and this is where it's gone through, and these are the actual events that have gone through and happened, and what category they fall in.
And I suppose you mentioned about the looking at managed SOC in the past. And I suppose has the limiting factor always been the cost of a managed SOC for you, and I suppose the difference being this time that it doesn't feel as much of a financial burden because it's an add-on and you've already got some of the cost, whereas maybe with a managed SOC you'd have to swap products as well.
I think that was it. With the managed SOC, there'd be that guarantee that we could go through and know that they had our best interests at heart, and that they were able to go through and gather the intelligence and information from the endpoints and the rest of the infrastructure that they'd need for it to actually be effective. Sitting within the Sophos side of things, we can go through and wrap it all within that the single kind of product suite and know that they're getting the information that they need to.
Just want to say that I appreciate that I look like a geography teacher there. That wasn't intentional during the film of that video, and probably in the future I'll decide not to dress like a geography teacher when doing a recorded video. Costa, I'll hand back over to you.
No problem. What are you trying to say about geography teachers? I think you look great, James. And I'll not take the bold comments personally either. I lost my hair long before I got into security, so it's just natural. Anyway, at this point, obviously, you guys have probably gathered by now, we just really wanted to use the tail end of the session to talk a little bit around some of the services and products that Sophos do offer. James has done a great job there of going through the managed threat response service and why we call it managed threat response. And obviously, we've just had that customer use case as well. So hopefully that was good for everybody to see. But maybe just taking a step back, bit of a 10,000-foot view for the Sophos strategy, as we call it. We have this ethos internally that is based around the Sophos adaptive cybersecurity ecosystem that you can see on the screen now. The idea is that everything that we offer starts from what we call Sophos Central. So if you're an existing Sophos customer, you'll be aware that Sophos Central is our cloud management platform. But for all those who are here who are maybe using some other solutions today, Sophos Central relies on no on-prem infrastructure. It's completely based in the cloud. We actually use AWS as our architecture here as the infrastructure, and the idea is that we are able to pinpoint the data regions that we want to have data in when we set up our own Sophos Central instance. So if you wanted to be a new customer, for example, you can choose an EU data center to know where your data sits in regions that aren't under any scrutiny, for example. Now, with that being said, Sophos Central traditionally, for a number of years, was just our management pane of glass. We've referred to it for many years as our single pane of glass. But as time has gone on and as the product sets and the services and solutions that we offer have evolved, we now also view this as our security operations dashboard as well. And what do I mean by that? Well, we've talked today around XDR and EDR solutions. We've talked today around MDR solutions and incident response. And if you just take a look at some of the Sophos software product offerings that you can see on the left-hand side, if we picked out our endpoint protection, for example, if we picked out our workload, so server and even cloud workload protection, if we pick out our mobile, our email, and even our firewall product solution in a virtual capacity, all of those products all feed into what we call our data lake. And our data lake is effectively a 30-day offline repository of telemetry that we can use to conduct contextualized threat hunting over. And I will demonstrate this very, very quickly as I'm conscious of time with just a couple of use cases towards the end of this today. But the idea is that we also offer, as you'll see on the right-hand side, services to do with this as well. So MTR, Managed Threat Response, is just what James was describing. This is our 24/7 Sophos delivered security operations center. And the way that this works is based purely off the same agent that is being used today for our standard endpoint protection, for example. We can tie feeds in from our firewalls, from our cloud security posture management product. And throughout this year, we're also tying in a variety of third-party telemetry. And we've started that today with some Azure and Office 365 audit log capability as well. But the idea is that this is our own security operations center. We will look at the telemetry that comes out of your environment and we will apply the context. We will perform the investigations, and without the need for an incident response retainer or similar, we will be responsible for handling the containerization and remediation of a threat that may occur in your environment or an attempt for a threat to occur in your environment whilst we're doing that proactive monitoring. Saying that, I would be remiss to not also mention that outside of our dedicated managed threat response service, we do also offer an incident response service for non-Sophos customers and maybe for Sophos customers who aren't on our MTR service. Rapid response is something I referred to earlier. It's our dedicated incident response team. We can have an engagement as a non-Sophos customer for a 45-day fixed fee where we can come in, install our endpoint remotely, as it were, our solution, find out what the issue is that's in your environment, as it were, and then look to contain and remediate that before transitioning you onto the rest of your service, onto the managed threat response service, the advanced tier of that. Because we know that when it comes to cybersecurity incidents, that lightning does unfortunately strike twice. So if there is multiple attempts over that 45-day period, we're there to help you deal with that throughout that time period. The good thing about this, and not taking any shots here at any incident response from cybersecurity insurance or similar, is that there is no additional caveats to this for us. We're not saying that if you get breached by a different ransomware gang in that period of time that we won't help and that you'll have to make another claim. We're saying for 45 days, you're effectively covered by the managed threat response service, and something that is in one way great to see some good uptake for, in another way not so great, because we're obviously seeing that unfortunately there are people in the world, non-Sophos customers, that are getting hit with direct attacks. So really, with a non-commercial hat on here, if I can use my shifting left concept to make a description of what I think would be best, is rather than have a reactive service like rapid response be dialed in to save the day, as it were, why not have a service that is providing this as an included part of a service to monitor your environment 24/7 with the managed threat response service itself. But to be fair, for those who are considering building out their own SOC or maybe upskilling their own teams to be able to provide cybersecurity in an enhanced fashion today, just to really point out that the managed threat response team basically use the same tooling that our XDR offering offers as well. So using this just purely as a representative example here, we have tie-ins from our endpoint network and our cloud security posture management piece, all going into that data lake of data to conduct investigations over. XDR provides what we call Xdr Detections, which are scrubbed data, scrubbed telemetry to provide you with context of the areas we think you should look into. Just to be clear, if we see something malicious, then of course our protection product is going to be stopping that. But the idea here is that XDR is highlighting things for you to investigate. And if we directly relate those to the MTR service, they are considered leads. Leads are what the MTR service would use to automatically conduct an investigation on your behalf. That means the AI isn't just involved here at this stage. A human analyst, a member of our SOC team, will be looking at your telemetry, looking at the telemetry surrounding that piece that has been highlighted as an indicator, and applying their real world battle hardened knowledge to understand if that is a piece of noise, if it's the use of PowerShell by an admin who, maybe decided to do something late one night as a piece of overtime, for example. And just because it's a service that's outsourced, of course, it means that we aren't just running this with our eyes closed, as it were. We communicate with you. We have different response modes where we check in to say, hey, is this you? Are you aware of this activity? Are you aware that you've got this piece of software that has a vulnerability, for example? So there's a lot of really cool stuff that goes on with the MTR service there. But the point remains that the Xdr software solution there gives you the same tooling as our MTR team themselves. Now, it's at this point I was thinking of jumping over and doing a very, very, very quick demo, James. But I guess, can I just check in with you? How are we doing for time? And if we're okay, can I be given share screen access, please?
I think we're a little bit tight on time just because we're already at 1:30. Just looking at the timings at the moment, so I think we might have to let's keep going, and if we've got time in the end, we'll slot it in at the end, if that's all right.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. So just progressing on with this then, there was a question, I don't think it's been passed through on the published piece, but I saw it in one of our new areas here, which is a question around, are we saying that Sophos as an endpoint protection suite isn't good enough either? And that did come through from an anonymous, I can't say anonymous today, an anonymous attendee. So just really to give you guys, sorry, can you press back again on that, James? Oh, it's happened. Just to really give you some context here, everything that we offer from an XDR and a solution and an MTR service is based primarily from the endpoint solution that we call InterceptX. And so all of the different parts of the attack chain that we have discussed at several points so far today do have coverage from our endpoint solution, as has been outlined on this particular slide. So whether it's a combination of our signatures, whether it's a combination of our machine learning or our behavioral-based detection capabilities, you can see there's a lot of places on this threat chain that we can be involved and provide protections in those places. And in fact, if we can be as candid as possible, the reason that we are so good with the MTR service and that our XDR solution can remain quite light touch is that in an environment where Sophos is fully deployed, we can have a very, very high confidence that the product does what it's supposed to do. And with that in mind, it then allows our SOC analysts, or indeed your SOC analysts using XDR, to spend time focused on the things that are truly suspicious, that haven't been recognized by traditional AV, as we're potentially calling it here. The use of those tools, finding out who used them, where they used them, what else did they access at that time. And if, of course, there has been any other artifacts that have been dropped to establish and maintain persistence. Your typical security solution without that type of telemetry isn't going to block those types of changes on your system. Frankly, if they did, they'd be extremely hard to manage because, well, if every time we blocked something that tried to write to registry or a firewall change, then, well, you'd have a very, very, very noisy system to manage overall. But as I mentioned, of course, this forms the foundation of the MTR service. So there are plenty of use cases for the Managed Threat Response Service online, and we'll be following up for all attendees and of course those who dial into the recording as well, so that they can see some of our casebooks, some of our published articles where the MTR team have been very successful, and indeed some incidents where we've been swooped in as the incident response service for rapid response, and we'll share some of those, but we'll do that, of course, after today's session. But just as a reminder, just to really cover again what James was talking about and to sow my seed here with the MTR service, as a reminder, this is a 24/7 service that we provide to you. This is something that isn't just relying on AI and it isn't just relying on technology. There is truly a team of humans that are looking at your telemetry for you to provide that context and to provide the response for you included as part of this service. One of the real things that separates us from the rest of the market at this stage is that incident response is included, as I've mentioned many times now, at no additional cost. So if you sign up to MTR and next week you incur a breach or an attempted breach, the next day, the next week, the next month, we'll continue to support you and there'll be no additional costs there that are required. And again, another differentiator for us is the fact that we leverage Sophos Labs. Sophos has been around since 1985, maybe viewed as one of the old school traditional security vendors. But Sophos Labs is one of 3 or 4 other tier 1 security research centers in the world. So we actually sell our threat intelligence to many other vendors and across many other different verticals. And really, they have that two-way street with the MTR team, so that based on their threat research, our customers, the MTR customers, can benefit from looking at those indicators of attack, indicators of breach, indicators of compromise, even long before the product itself is able to protect against them, for example. Similarly, if the MTR team uncover something that they've never seen before and that we don't have any information on, the power of the Sophos Labs team can be used to reverse engineer those indicators of compromise to, again, empower the MTR team to have the best knowledge possible about what's going on. And another nice bit of this is that we can have that virtuous circle where we reinvest these protections back into the product so that anything that has been discovered by labs or by MTR can be protected moving forwards, which again reduces that noise for those services so that we can continue to focus on those never before seen 0-day type threats and attacks. And James has mentioned this many times. There's lots of reporting that comes out of this. There's an MTR dashboard that customers have access to, but you are taken along on the journey. You are not just on the sideline. We inform you of every action that we are looking to do, every investigation, every threat hunt. You're always part of that. This isn't a service that we lock you out of the product. You have full access to the tool set yourself whilst the MTR team is already involved. And again, that for us is a great differentiator because it means that you can still use the product to do IT hygiene based tasks as well. Now, just to shine a tiny bit of insight here, and again, I'm conscious of time, just to make you aware, there are 3 response modes that the MTR team can work in. You can choose and set these at any given point in time. They don't incur any additional costs. And the idea here is that we work in the way that best suits you. So if you literally just want us to be, I'll coin a phrase here, a fancy alarm system and just notify you about the investigations that we've done, but not take any action for you, notify mode could be a great one for you. We tell you what we've seen and we give you what we think you should do to take action against the active adversary that we've seen, for example. Or on the complete opposite side of that, you can authorize us. We can be in a position where we conduct that full end-to-end investigation all the way over and through to the prioritized and targeted response actions that can be anything from isolating a machine all the way up through remote terminaling to that device to make changes, remove files, and make sure that that device is restored to its original state of play from before the active adversary was introduced. However, saying that, the one in the middle, Collaborate, just so happens to be where the majority of our customers sit. The idea here being that during your core working hours, we notify you. And at that point, you have a choice to say, Sophos, yes, please, can you handle this? We don't have the time or capacity to deal with this threat. Can you please sort that out for us? Or you can say, thank you for informing us, Sophos, we'll go and handle the containment based on your recommendations. The great thing about this collaborate mode is that there is a tick box that allows you to authorize us if your nominated contacts are not available. So if it then does turn into a case of it's now out of hours and we try to ring your authorized contacts and nobody picks up, we can automatically move into authorization mode if you have ticked that box under collaborate. And again, that can be changed at any given time. So if you guys are all going to a party at the end of the financial year, if you're all going out somewhere, going on holiday, or maybe you've started to reinvest back into the team to bring some more people in, you want to skill them up, you can choose between these modes that best suit you at literally any point in time throughout that contract at no additional cost. And I think the last 2 things just for me to cover here before we go over to the Q&A, I do think we won't have time for the live demo here, but I talked about some of this already. There is, of course, a lot of technology that goes into the back end of the product and the service that we offer here. And so there is also a lot of playbooks that we have for things that we have seen before. And that is ultimately part of that virtuous cycle. If we've seen a threat and we have dealt with it on multiple occasions and we know exactly what artifacts to expect to see, we could put that in the camp of an automated threat hunt that takes place. It will automatically generate a case for an analyst to investigate, and they can follow a playbook and they can deal with whatever it is that has breached or raised that telemetry piece. The other two, though, this is where we start to put a line in the sand between our standard MTR service and our advanced MTR service. With the standard service, you get automated and you get lead-driven threat hunting. If you recall, I mentioned that leads were generated by our Xdr toolset to provide some contextualized pieces of telemetry for our threat hunters and our SOC analysts to investigate on your behalf. A leadless threat hunt, on the other side of this, however, is not based on any lead. So this means that should there be a brand new, never before seen vulnerability, and we have seen nothing of any sort of noise that comes out of your environment for it, we can go in and do methodology-based threat hunting and what we call proactive posture improvement here to go and see if there's anything in your environment that would relate to what we're seeing in customers that are maybe in the same vertical as you, for example. I use the recent log4j vulnerability. It was interestingly not taken advantage of as much as we thought it might be, but those with the MTR advanced customer service had leadless threat hunts performed in their environments, where Sophos provided details about machines that had certain vulnerable versions of Java and similar installed, and were also able to provide some targeted response actions where required, and some advisory steps for the customers to follow to make sure that they no longer have those vulnerabilities. The flip side of this as well is that with the advanced MTR service, you have direct call-in support to the MTR SOC. So you can literally pick up the phone to that security operations center and ask them to perform a leadless threat hunt. Maybe if we use the term that's been thrown around a bit today, to help you sleep better at night, knowing that what you've read about online, for example, what you've spoken to a friend or ex-colleague about, isn't affecting your environment, because our SOC analysts can go in and look for what you're concerned about, even if it is just to do so for a peace of mind. And reality is, the way that this all feeds into the SOC, well, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of telemetry points, so this is very much just a small sample of data here, but I just thought it was worthwhile highlighting how we go through some potential investigations and telemetry. So it isn't all about what the product sees as malicious and suspicious activity. You'll notice over here, failed login attempts, account lockouts, what services are running, what ports, processes, and sockets are open and running, what extensions we've got on different browsers. They're all context for any investigation that the MTR service performs. And ultimately, based on what we see, that shapes the threat hunt and the potential incident response that comes out of this. Yes, the products that we offer do a very, very good job at stopping a lot of these exploits to begin with. And yes, that telemetry is used and also fed into the SOC. But for example, if we did say have a malicious traffic detection event, as we can see MTD there, the point here isn't just to have an alarm that said, what did we block and why? The MTR service would potentially use that telemetry to go and say, where did this even originate from? Is it from an email, for example, that was opened via Outlook that isn't being managed by Sophos, for example, as an email security piece? Could we then use that to go back to you as a customer and say, hey, this originated with an email that was sent to Joe Blogs, and they clicked on a link, for example, that downloaded a file that caused this malicious traffic detection event when it reached out to a known command and control server? So there's a lot of context that goes into this. And if you think back to what I've been talking about a lot, visibility is hugely key. So we can't just focus on the things that we convict. We do very much have to focus on all of that surrounding information as well. And I think that's everything from me, James. I've left us about 15 minutes for Q&A, but I've also left this maybe for yourself to ask these questions at this stage, something for our attendees to consider.
Yeah, I'll leave this on the screen for a second. It's something that I definitely think you guys who have joined us today will want to take these questions away and ask yourself these questions, because this really leads into everything we've been talking about today. Everything from how would you deal with a network security breach, all the way through to, do you have the right tools to, that's the question. Obviously, ask yourself that when you finish today's webinar, and obviously if the answer to those questions is you don't have the right tools or you don't know how you deal with stuff, please feel free to reach out and we can help you on that journey. So I'm going to rattle through these question and answers. There's a few of them that I can sort of crunch together, as it were. There's questions around, I'm going to start in reverse because it's the way it's come up on my screen, talking around how MTR is licensed and how much it costs. So MTR is licensed per user endpoint and per server, and the pricing depends on the size of your organization. If you're interested in seeing that pricing, it's not something that both myself and Costa would have access to. We're not naturally salespeople in that regard. But what you can do is if you make sure that you comment with either your name, or if you've already got your name on the comment, we'll get your account manager from our end at Planet just to reach out and just give you some idea about how that pricing looks. I wouldn't want to be disingenuous and give you a price and say it's X amount, because obviously it all depends on your use case and your scenario, but it is designed to be massively more cost effective than putting a team in place. Costa, you may be able to answer this question because I don't have the information on the top of my head. What's the response time for the MTR service?
I'll answer that in a second. I just would like to just tag on to one of your answers there as well. If people are attending this call and really interested in the MTR offering, we don't like just to drop quotes, as it were. Yes, you can just have a quote if you like. If we really get into a proper conversation about this, one of the things that we can provide is an MTR proposal. Now, the MTR proposal is not just specifically focused at giving you the costs, but also going through the service's nuances, as it were, how it works, and we'll talk about response times in a moment, but also what it might look like for you to set up a SOC for your own organization. And we do that based on your region, your locality, the size of your business, similar businesses, just to give you a rough idea so that you've got something comparatively. As we know, services frankly cost more than solutions, and therefore it gives you something more tangible to go back to board members with to discuss. And even if it's just an early sowing the seed type of conversation, we think it's really important and valuable to have that, as opposed to just this is how much the service costs per user, for example. I hope that was okay just to tag that in, by the way, James.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely.
So just answering the question there about what is the response time of MTR. So we don't use what are known as SLAs. We have, so not service level agreements, we have service level targets. And right now we're actually beneath them. But the idea is that we are focused on trying to ensure, firstly, that the telemetry gets to the MTR service in less than 2 minutes, and that we're conducting guided investigations and response actions within 30 and 60-minute time periods. Now, again, these are service level targets, and I'm actually really quite proud to say that we're well below those in this particular instance. The mean time to detect for us at the moment is less than 1 minute. And that's with over 8,000 customers on MTR, with nearly 2 million individual devices feeding into that SOC. So to be able to provide that in less than a minute is, well, frankly, pretty outstanding. The actual mean time to respond at the moment is around 12 minutes as well. So you think about from the point of a telemetry hitting, if that's at 2 o'clock in the morning, to potentially have a resolution that happens within minutes is really, really powerful. And again, I've got a particular use case that I used to talk to customers about, where there was the use of a disingenuous TeamViewer tool. It was just came from a download when somebody Googled TeamViewer. It installed a separate package and tried to do other things on that machine. Within 6 minutes, an MTR analyst had picked it up and dealt with that particular suspicious activity. So it is very, very quick. I hope that helps.
Yeah, there's a question I'm just going to answer. I'm going to read it out to everyone and I'll answer it. So if you're talking about the rapid response service and they're already a Sophos customer, would you be able to claim this against your cyber insurance, or would they pay these costs? That would all depend on that question of, will your cyber insurance recognize that service? I know that certainly some cyber insurances will say they will allot you a amount of money to spend on resolving an issue. They don't care how you resolve it, they just care that it's resolved. But in most cases, they would have a dedicated company or team that they work with. So yeah, in regards to that, it would be a case of checking with your provider, but there certainly are some providers that allow that. A couple more MTR questions. costs are probably more for you. So in terms of the firewall requirements for MTR, obviously we mentioned XGS in the little Venn diagram, but can you also use an SG, or is a firewall even a requirement to have MTR?
Great question. So firstly, firewall is not a requirement to have MTR. It is just another great piece that we can have from telemetry to feed into the SOC. Whether you can use the SG versus XG, unfortunately, it is just the XG based operating systems, so the Sophos operating systems, and there is a requirement there for them to be on V18 so that they can communicate and share their telemetry with Sophos Central, which ultimately feeds into the data lake, which is where we perform that threat hunting over. Saying that, if you do have SGs that you heavily rely on, there is the alternative, which today is potentially an XG sensor. So a virtual appliance that just hangs off on a mirror port and will use all the IPS and ATP data to feed in to the XG team without disrupting the actual network flow going to your SG. And later this year, we're releasing the BrainTrace NDR network detection and response connector that will be a virtual appliance as well. So again, negates the need for the XG there because we can use another network telemetry tool.
Perfect. Another question straight to you would be, obviously, where are the MTR team based physically? Is it in the UK or is it elsewhere?
Again, great question. So the MTR team is based throughout the world in the same way that we have our support based throughout the world. We have got a follow the sun model, and obviously there's people that work on shift. So there's people based in the UK, there's people based in America, in Canada, in Australia, in the APAC regions. This is a truly global service, and the reason that we can do it at such scale is due to that. What I will point out is that the data that feeds into your data lake as a Sophos customer follows and stays with the region that you set your Sophos Central instance up in. So there's a difference between your data being accessed and your data being stored there. It still follows your selected region.
Perfect. Just to pivot away from MTR for a second, we've got a question around if you have someone in your team who is a disgruntled employee and is leaving the company and they leave a logic bomb on your network without you knowing it, would your cyber security insurance cover this, or would it be void because it happened within your own team? What would be the legal response to this? So it's a bit of a loaded question, I suppose, but it's an interesting thought. In most cases, cyber security insurance, providing that you had all the right tools in place and you're ticking all the boxes they require, if it's a disgruntled employee, they're still going to protect you. That said, obviously, if that person that plants that particular, ransomware, whatever it may be, is part of your security team, that may raise questions about the vetting and the process you go through for recruiting staff. So you will have some challenges there. And ultimately, your legal recourse, that would, it depends on the terms and conditions you've got your employees under. In most cases, obviously, you should have a Computer Misuse Act or something along the guidelines of what your staff should and shouldn't be doing with your machines, and that should cover you enough to be able to follow up with legal proceedings if you needed to, should it affect your business. But it's going to be one of those. It's a very delicate subject, and it will end up one of those things that involves HR and every man and his dog in the organisation, unfortunately, if those kind of things happen. I'm just going to go through some more of the questions. So a question asked quite at the start around false positives, so PowerShell, PS1 files, repositories like PSGet, NuGet, etc., being picked up by endpoint defender products. From your experience, Costa, I'm assuming you probably look at the same way I would, in terms of we kind of want those things being flagged as potentially risky, because a PS1 file is a great place to hide some code that could do something nasty to the system. But likewise, if you know they're trusted, you could look at exclusions in something like Sophos to stop them coming up all the time.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I firstly want to just make sure this doesn't come across as any sort of vendor bashing, because you mentioned Defender endpoint there. Obviously, false positives can happen with any solution. When it comes to the third-party testing, we do really well with lack of false positives. But let's just use the false positive as an example. If it's a false positive of the use of a genuine tool or a genuine file, would we want to completely ignore it because we think that it's a false positive, or would we want to do our due diligence to be sure? And I think this is again where we have that option that there is false positives from protection that block something, and there's false positives or noise that comes from an EDR, XDR solution. If it's a false positive that's been blocked, okay, great. It might be a bit of an inconvenience for us to look into it and potentially create a exclusion, as you rightly suggested there, James. But if it comes through as, let's say, PowerShell being used with encoded scripts on an EDR solution like ours, for me, that's a perfect opportunity to actually perform an investigation and use that as a learning opportunity as well. If the MTR service is involved, for example, and that triggers a lead, they would still investigate it. They don't look at something and just assume that it's white noise. So in some ways, yes, FPs are good. They can be a little bit troublesome, but it also does for me highlight the need for needing to be sure that it is a false positive. It's very easy to dismiss something, and we've seen that countless breaches where something was dismissed as a false positive, only for it again to be a truly active adversary dropping some bombs, as it were. So yeah, there's yeah, not logic bombs, but malicious code, for example. But yeah, there's a couple of ways that you can look at that, and I think ultimately having a good solution in the first place that reduces that noise is always good, but equally having somebody looking at it to provide that context is of higher importance.
Definitely. I'm aware that we're getting very close on time. I'm going to rattle through a few more of the questions. I'm sorry if I can't get to all of your questions you asked. Anything that's asked that's got a name against it, we will come back to you outside of this to make sure you do get an answer. There's a few that I obviously can't share as well for reference of what they've got inside them. So someone's mentioned about they're not sure that cyber insurance provides any real cover. I have seen many cases where cyber insurance has paid out and has helped an organization bounce back from a breach. What we're trying to highlight today is the fact that not everything is the same, and you need to be really aware of what the expectation on you as a business is and you as an IT person is from that cyber insurance, because a lot of people use it as a tick box exercise to say they've got it. You know, you're going for a tender or you're going to win a certain contract, you have to have cyber insurance, so you go for whatever the cheapest offering, the easiest one to get up and running is. The real terms of it needs to protect your business, and you need to understand that that's the right fit for you. There's so many offerings out there, and I suppose what I would always look at is the risk versus reward in terms of how much you're paying versus how much protection they're going to give you, and that always becomes the challenge when you're looking at cyber insurance in that regard. And then the final question I was going to come to was around how much is enough to spend on system protection, network protection, relevant tools, etc. There's no like magic bullet for this, and I think Costa, you'll probably agree. There's no kind of like, yeah, spend £10,000 and you've got everything you need. It leans back on that full stack approach. We need to be covering every avenue of your system and having tools and protection that covers everything. It's no good having an amazing endpoint protection product but having no email protection, no firewall. Likewise, I've seen organizations that have spent thousands of pounds on great firewalling and then have an email system that's got no protection and they've got an open RDP system. Like, you have to have the right technologies in the right place, and that's where that kind of zero trust approach comes in, is knowing that you do have the right tools in the right place and that they're backed up by a vendor who you know has the pedigree to deliver what it's saying it's going to deliver. There's lots of security vendors out there. There's lots of solutions, and it's making sure it's the right fit for what you're trying to do in every vertical. There's some verticals that Sophos don't sit in, and I'm sure that there's lots of products where you'll see that Sophos sits in that top right in the Magic Quadrant from Gartner, and there's a reason it's up there, is because it provides that protection, which is why we've partnered with Sophos today to deliver this content to you. It's about finding that right solution, and I don't think there's any one right answer to that. But that said, for those of you who are thinking that question, feel free to reach out to me after this and we can have a conversation outside of this with a bit more granular detail about your systems and the way you're approaching things, and hopefully we can share some pearls of wisdom from what we've touched on. I'm really aware of time, so I'm going to, unfortunately, going to have to wrap this up. So any questions that we haven't got back to, between myself and Barry, and we'll come back to everyone on those. So if you do have any questions after today where you think I should have asked that, my email address addresses there, telephone numbers there. Feel free to give me a shout. I'm always available. Well, I say always available. I'll try to be available as much as possible to answer your questions. You can also reach out to your Planet IT account manager. They will help you. They will bring my team in or some of our security team in where it's relevant to make sure that everything gets dealt with as much as possible. So that
James,
brings me.
I hate to just close your flow there just as you're about to close, but I really just want to add into that context about how much is the right amount to spend.
Of course.
And this really relates to the rapid response service versus the MTR service. Obviously, rapid response, we talked about being a 45-day fixed fee piece for us to come in and help deal with an active threat. Now, non-Sophos customers or Sophos customers without MTR, I would be, again, remiss to not point out how many people will pay double bubble to get it remediated and then go and buy the service that they could have paid for in the first place. So the question that I always like to try and ask is, how much would it cost you as an organization if something went wrong? And then it's weighing up the risk versus reward of having or not having a particular service solution in place. And only, of course, you and the business can make those types of decisions. But the last thing I hate to see is people claiming on insurance, claiming incident response, and then going and buying something thereafter to make sure that it never happens again. I really am that prevention is better than cure where possible. So yeah, hopefully useful just to relay that.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. So obviously that brings us to the end of today's event. Obviously, I'd like to thank Costa for joining us today and imparting all of his wisdom and taking all of the questions. As I said, anything that we've not answered, I know there's a load of questions that Barry's just flagged to me that we've not managed to get to, but we are unfortunately at the end of the event today. We will come back to you we should have your email address and details anyway from your registration, so we will feed those back. You will get the survey sent out to you after the end of today's event with a copy of this recording with everything that goes with it, along with that opportunity to get yourself that Amazon voucher. But that brings me to the end. So thank you very much for your time and for listening to us for the last 2 hours. And I look forward to seeing you on the next Planet webinar, and we shall speak soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.